Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is the return of Tim and I's OG program, the Terror of Demons show. And we're going to be talking about the Charlie Kirk affair, which everyone's talking about. But the point of this program is to talk about things from a manly Catholic perspective and try to offer insight and real solutions to the problems that face us as Catholic men. So we thought we'd bring on the dad of Catholic Twitter, Eric Sammons. Eric Sammons, thank you for joining us today. And we're going to talk about the Charlie Kirk affair, as I said. But before we do that, I do have a special announcement. You're going to want to go to piouspelican.com. Tim and I have been working on something behind the scenes. We've been working on something to try to bring sound Catholics together to produce better content, educational, entertainment, homeschooling, lifestyle, everything you need. Something big is coming, and you're going to want to stay tuned. So check out piouspelican.com. Link for that in the description, and there you go. All right, gentlemen. Before we begin, I would like to read something from Bishop Strickland. Bishop Strickland put something on his website, on his Pillars of Faith, and I'm just going to read a small passage from there about the death of Charlie Kirk. And I copied and pasted a little bit of two paragraphs together because I thought it was the most relevant for what we're going to talk about today. So bear with me while I just read this quickly for you. He said, "My friends, I do not write to glorify any man. Salvation is in Christ alone, and his church is the ark of salvation. But I do write to say this. When Catholics look outside the church for heroes, when we see courage more evident in the world and in our pulpits, chancery offices, and pews, it is time for us to tremble. It is time to repent. It is time to ask for a new Pentecost. For let us be clear, while voices like Charlie's rang out, the church too often lay silent. We who should be the trumpet of truth have become a whisper. Instead of proclaiming Christ crucified, we projected images of Pope Francis onto the holy facade of St. Peter's Basilica. We honored the earth with pagan symbols as if the Creator himself were not enough. We have lain down in the dirt and surrendered not to Christ but to the spirit of the age. This is not the bride Christ died for. This is not the faith of the martyrs." Unquote. I thought that was fitting to begin with. What, Eric, why don't you start? What was your initial reaction or your initial thoughts on the death of Charlie, the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, I think I kind of went through a progression. First was shock. I found out about it from you, Kennedy, because I was recording a podcast and you text me like, oh, because of the Charlie Kirk shooting, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what? I'm like, what is he even talking about? And I jumped on X to find out what was going on. So I was shocked because like, I didn't even know what you were talking about. And I was like, Charlie Kirk shooting. And then I got angry very quickly. And I think that's a legitimate reaction as well. And then I will say, I got worried because I see where the country's going. I think that this is a major event in American history, and I think I don't know where it's going, but I just know that there's a really good chance our country will not be the same in 10 years than it is today. Now, I don't think our country's doing well right now, so I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying it's a major change, and that does make me a bit worried because I know that some of the directions it could go could actually be worse than now, believe it or not. And some directions it could be better. So that was like my initial kind of thoughts in the first hour or two as I started to process it, especially once I realized he had died. Because originally, remember, we didn't know if he had died or not. I was like, if he lives, there's still a chance that we could, but then once he died, I'm like, okay, this is not going to be good. In a lot of ways, but more importantly, it's just going to be a major change in our country.
Tim, what about you?
I was in the great state of Michigan with a number of non-Michiganders, including two Canadians and yourself, Kennedy, when I heard the news. And so we were all reacting together as a community, lots of anger and frustration. And honestly, I was not too familiar with Charles Kirk. I hadn't really followed him, didn't really know much of his statements until now. But it deeply affected me in a way I was not expecting. I mean, there's been various violences recently, terrible, terrible violence. But this was something that did feel like a turning point. It did feel different. I think that's a very common feeling of many. Um, and looking forward to discussing some practical next steps.
One thing I just wanted to throw in there real quick is that I've talked to a lot of young men since the shooting, and it like Tim said, it affected him. It affected me as well. But the way it's affected young men is quite dramatic. I mean, it's something we because that was his main audience, young people. But I've noticed young men in particular have taken this very, very seriously, very hard. And I think that's something that makes it even more, because young men are the ones that are going to be the kind of leaders on the front of change. And so their reaction matters a lot more than maybe an old guy like me's reaction. But, and I think that's something that I found very profound, how much young men in particular have been impacted by this.
Well, Eric, you wrote an article for Crisis Magazine about basically how the time for dialogue is over. And I want to make sure I get your quote properly here. I just had it up, but of course I've lost it. In any event, you said the time for dialogue is over. And it's clear that the left, the Marxists, whatever you want to call them, the enemy doesn't want to have any dialogue. And I tweeted something, and this kind of goes into my initial reaction, because I wasn't angry at the beginning, not because I don't think anger is justified. Anger, righteous anger, of course, is justified. You should be angry at bad stuff. But I tweeted the following, I think the day after, and I said, one of the reasons the death of Charlie Kirk, may God rest his soul, has hit so many so hard is like the sadness that people feel on the eve of war. Although a heavy-handed reaction and cleanup are justified, knowing what it will cost brings its own heaviness. And that was my initial response. That was my initial feeling. I remember having this feeling of weight, a heaviness, because I thought to myself, I mean, personally, whatever, the term red pill, etc., all of us here have known that there's, a problem with the wizard behind the curtain for a long time. It's not as if my country or your country is a great Catholic kingdom. There are clearly problems with liberalism and communism and Marxism and all the isms that are bad. And there has been this constant sentiment amongst, let's say, right-wing people for a long time that, man, oh man, if we don't clean this up, things are going to get really bad. Man, oh man, if we don't clean this up, things are going to get really bad. Obviously during the COVID times, that was a big part of it. Were we going to go full totalitarian regime? Were the refuseniks like myself going to be thrown in, unvaccinated camps in the Canadian Siberia? Like, all those things were in the back of our minds. But then things seem like they're going to get really bad. And then they kind of, stabilize a bit. They tried to shoot Trump, but they missed. And then he won the election. And it's not even really about Trump. It's more about what is represented by those who don't hate Trump is, basically normal people, right? It's an attack on normalcy and sanity. And then when this poor young man, he was 31, a beautiful wife, faithful Catholic wife, and 2 children, 2 beautiful little girls, we all saw it. When we saw him get shot, I immediately thought to myself, okay, the time for dialogue, I think it's long been over, but it's really over now. And now there are bullets firing, and they didn't miss. And they didn't even go after a politician. I mean, not that any political assassinations of this style would be, are good, but when politicians get killed, America's not the only country to have assassinations. I mean, in the third world, it's like the cost of doing business. We all kind of understand that it's kind of like when a law enforcement officer takes a bullet. It's sad, but it's kind of an occupational hazard in a sense. Like, you're putting yourself there. But when a guy who's just talking, literally just talking, gets shot, then you kind of go, all right. They've gone from trying to kill or killing the actual professionals, the actual politicians, to we're just going to kill people that don't say things we like. And when you get to that point, I just think that you're beyond. I mean, I think we already were, but you're far beyond. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that if it was just Charlie Kirk being assassinated, that would be awful. That would mean something. But the reaction, I think, tells us a lot more, because it could just be a crazy guy who just Charlie Kirk said something that offended him and he was unbalanced and he shot him, and and then everybody laments that, everybody condemns the shooter, and then we move on. It'd be awful for the Kirk family, but it wouldn't be a national event that could pivot the entire direction of the country. The fact that there was a large number of leftists who celebrated it, who called him a fascist, believed it was justified, all those things. And it's not, and at one point I was like, well, is this just an internet reaction that we kind of magnifies, and it's, everybody says dumb things on the internet. But then the more I saw, the more I realized, no, this isn't just a small segment of the leftist movement that's just like, the crazy ones of the group. It's the normal ones of the group who are basically celebrating this, which means that means there is a large segment of our population. I don't know what percentage it is, but it's big enough that you could measure. Is it 5%, 10%, 20%? I don't know. That literally wants to kill us. Like you, me, Tim, all of us wants to kill us because we are not going along with their lies. And Charlie Kirk compared to us is a moderate. And so,
He's
and he was,
ecumenical.
yeah, exactly. And he was called a fascist. So what the heck are we? I don't even know. But the point is that that really kind of confirmed in my mind that the time for dialogue is over. And dialogue, as it's been, I have a whole book about this, of course, but dialogue as it's been presented by the world over the past, 60 years or so, and particularly in the Catholic Church, has always been flawed, because it's always had a fundamentally flawed understanding of the human person and of how we reach the truth. There was always the assumption, and you can see it in the documents of like Paul VI and some others back in the 60s, and it continued on. There's an assumption is, if we sit down with people we disagree with and we just basically say, okay, here's what I believe, here's what you believe, that somehow magically the truth will win out. That is simply not the way it's ever been done in Christian history. It's not the way it was done by Christ. The fact is what did Christ say? He didn't start his ministry by saying, hey, let's sit down and chat. I'll tell you what I think. You tell me what you think. We'll treat everything as equal. And then eventually we'll all come to this agreement. No, he said, repent and believe in the gospel. That's proclamation. That's not dialogue. And so, the funny thing is I would actually say the standards that the church uses for dialogue is not what Charlie Kirk did. He actually didn't dialogue, because he would be willing. He would always give the other side an opportunity to present its case, just like Thomas Aquinas would. And then he would say why the person's wrong. You never see that in Catholic dialogue. What you see is, okay, let's hear the Muslims talk about what they believe, and then that's it. We may even praise them and say how much we agree with them and stuff like that, and we'll never ever mention why they were wrong. So the days of dialogue are over, and should have never started. But I would also say that, like, even Charlie Kirk's methodology, which I admire him for, don't get me wrong, and there's still some use for it, that might not be our primary means anymore, because clearly they shot him for it and called him a fascist. So it might take some more robust reaction. And I'm laughing because I'm thinking inside my head, because I'm thinking about that video you shared on X, Kennedy, about with the two guys talking.
The group chats, yeah.
Yeah, the group chats, and I'm just like trying not to go there.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is that what that robust is, we can get into more details,
Yeah.
but just having open debate alone is not the way forward, because we'll just all get shot for that.
Well, that's a good segue.
I think,
sorry, go on, Tim.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask you a question, but you go and then I'll ask you the question.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. I think that there is, I like what you said, Eric. You just said there are many in the country. I liked how you put that, because you're actually speaking the truth there. You're not saying all leftists are X. because I mean, I got to give credit to Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders, of all people, who actually condemned it. And they said, we need to have free speech and all this stuff. But the problem is that the philosophical presupposition that justifies killing a human being is the same presupposition as free speech. In other words, truth is sacrificed for unity. Might makes right. Might makes right means I can kill you to impose my will. It's not about the truth. A majority vote can make a girl a boy. A majority vote can make an unborn child into a clump of cells. That's also might makes right. That's a majority vote voting gay marriage is an act of metaphysical violence because it is imposing our will on reality. And that's impossible. That's exactly what the gay marriage decision said. One of the Supreme Court justices of the United States, they said the essence of liberty is to create your own reality, which proves that the Roman goddess Libertas, which is erected at the New York Harbor, which we call Lady Liberty, but is actually a real goddess that the Romans worshipped. It means we're actually worshiping an idol, which brings me to Matt Gaspers, who's his idea to do this show on Monday. Sorry, Matt Gaspers couldn't be here, so I want to give his comment. He said he was responding to the presser, and I want to shout out to the Utah governor, who's I think his speech was like the light in the darkness in a lot of comments from right and left. But then there was the FBI director Cash, and Matt Gaspers responded to him because that I don't know, he must be a Hindu or something. I don't know what he is. Sorry, no disrespect intended, but Gaspers says, Director Cash, you know that Norse mythology and Marvel movies are fictional, right? You won't be seeing Charlie Kirk or anyone else in Valhalla. Repent and believe in the gospel. So what I'd like to say is, if we look at English history, the English Revolt, the English Reformation, so-called, was sacrificing truth for unity. And what was the unity of the English people based on under Henry VIII? It was the unity of negation. In other words, they united under the banner, not Jesus Christ in his vicar in Rome, not Roman Catholicism. They united, but then within 100 years, they had a civil war and they killed King Charles I. Same exact thing happened in America. We united under a unity of negation, which was not the king, not King George. Also not the Quebec Act, by the way, not Catholicism over there either. And then we had a civil war in 100 years. And we cannot have free speech, which ultimately sacrifices truth in the name of unity. It's just another form of the same metaphysical violence against truth.
Okay, I'm going to comment on that, and then I'm going to ask you the question, Tim. So I like how you brought up free speech, because I've been taking a lot of blows in recent years for being this crazy right-wing traditionalist Catholic who says the quiet part out loud, and I've been saying for a few years, as I'm sure you guys have, but I have a little less, I don't know, decorum sometimes in certain settings than you more refined gentlemen, and which I really don't. I don't know. I think it's just, it's subconscious anti-Catholic racism. You guys all need to go to re-education.
That's all.
Yeah. But no one believes in free speech because it's stupid. Like, let's actually follow this through. Like, you know, the biggest, most don't tread on me, and I don't mind the don't tread on me flag. I think it's kind of cool. I get the sentiment. Like, I am very leave me alone in my core. I would like to be left alone because most people suck at doing things that I could just do myself. I'm okay with that. I get the mentality. But even the most, like, my constitution, my gun rights, etc., like, everyone should be able to live their own life kind of guy, they have no problem when a group of, like, concerned conservative parents storm the school meeting and basically force the school not to teach the kids crazy, you know, racialized stuff, or whatever you call it, the critical race theory. Meaning, they actually don't think that you should be able to say anything you want in all settings. Because if we really believed in, like, full free speech, you know, no matter what, it's like, well, then teach the kids whatever you want. Like, any teacher should be able to say anything. But none of us actually believe that because it's stupid. And now we can make, you know, we can quibble about distinctions like, well, what counts as public property? What counts as private property? Like, do you need a permit? Like, okay, fine. You know, politicians can debate about whatever those things are. But the point is that this idea that you can proclaim whatever you'd like to proclaim to whomever you want in all scenarios, it just doesn't make any sense. No one actually believes it. Even the Michael Malices of the world, like the most libertarian, freedom, anarchist-minded guy, would probably still say, well, in my house, you can't say that because I at least have domain over my house. Like, when it really comes down to it, there's no such thing as freedom of speech. And the Ten Commandments tell us this, because we're not supposed to blaspheme. And God does not believe in free speech, so we can't believe in it either. Now, how do you police that? That's obviously a perennial question. And there are different approaches to that. And there are approaches that are more reasonable in some contexts than others. Generally speaking, it's obviously very difficult to ever police or, let's say, manage, personal conversations. I think if we were to take a Thomistic approach and we would consider not only the logic of the law itself, let's say in a hypothetical scenario where you would have something like speech laws, but also the reality that the law itself has to be respected in order for it to have any legitimacy in people's eyes. Going down the road of actually trying to do the Minority Report, control what you say and think, that's just ridiculous because you're not going to be able to do it. Obviously, you're going to look like frauds in the long run, and it's going to delegitimize the power of the law anyway. But in the sense of in institutions, schools, church, public gatherings, even church institutions, because the church has authority over her own institutions, having things that you're not allowed to teach, having things you're not allowed to publish, having things that you're not allowed to say publicly without repercussions, that's a very Catholic idea. We kind of forget that we had the index of forbidden books, and that was a good thing, in a positive sense, not just negating, but we would trust historically imprimaturs. Now, an imprimatur isn't saying everything else contrary to this is necessarily false, but it's saying we like these words. Catholics should read these words. These words are good words, and people would look to that for approval. I personally believe that, I don't know how we're going to do it in our North American setting, because we obviously don't have Catholic countries in any official sense, but I would be happy to see censorship. I would be happy to see that from the right perspective, which is always the problem. But whenever people, criticize the so-called left, and I understand some viewers will say, hey, the left-right thing is a Hegelian dialectic. Trust me, I know. I wrote a lot about that in my book that Eric Sammons actually edited, my What Happened to Catholicism book. I'm no fan of the Hegelian dialectic, but we all use the term left and right. So let's just use that for the sake of conversation, because we all know what we mean by that. And if you want to know how to be effective at getting a message across, you should look at the Marxists. It's, as Fulton Sheen said, it's the anti-church. They have their own index of forbidden books. They have their own propaganda fide. It's just propagandize with bad things. They have their clerical class. They have discipline. They have heavy-handed restrictions when it's necessary in order to maintain the type of order they want. They kind of do everything you would expect from something like Christendom. They just do it for evil, so it leads to iniquity. The left is not crazy for wanting to, quote-unquote, cancel people. The left is not crazy for wanting to censor people. They just do it with evil satanic motives. And we've seen this, Eric. You tweeted something about, all the cancellations that happened in the COVID time. I was one of them in my employment. You were happy to see the sort of comeuppance come the other way. That's good. We should be embracing that, because leftism, I believe, atheism, Marxism, whatever, all the isms, it's inherently murderous because it's anti-logos, it's anti-God, it's anti-culture. The arguments themselves are not actually attractive from a logic perspective. They only rely on power. They only rely on force as their enforcement mechanism. So the question I have for you, Tim, do you think that this type of leftist violence will increase or decrease following this Charlie Kirk affair?
I think it will increase. We've already seen right-wing violence as well, and there is no logos. There was somebody like you said, the right and left is a dialectic. In America, it is. I think that America's presuppositions, like I said, are inherently anti-logos, anti-Christ, or at least anti-Rome in particular. I do think it will increase because there's no coherent solution. I think that what Trump is proposing is a short-term solution. There's no long-term solution out of Trump because, as correct me if I'm wrong, but his whole concept is, the presupposition is populism. In other words, what's popular? In other words, might makes right. In other words, truth, sacrifice for unity. Once again, and that's why he's promoting sodomites. He's promoting. We have a dubious Christian platform here. I don't know how pious he really is. I hope I'm wrong about all this. Obviously, I voted for Trump 3 times, by the way, so I'm not a hater of Trump. I'm just concerned about the long term here. I think there's too much celebration over Trump about the good stuff he's doing because I don't see a long term solution. I mean, we can look. I think we can look at particular things that have worked. For example, we have the colony of Maryland, which was founded. So let me back up a little bit. The Protestants created free speech because they had so many sects. Their very mechanism of their own sectarianism could not create unity and truth together. So they sacrificed truth for unity. That's what happened in the 18th and 19th century. The colony of Maryland was founded just so that Catholics could freely have the mass and not be butchered for it in England, which was founded, but they had a constitution which said there's nobody who does not profess the Trinity. No one can promote this blasphemy, any sort of heresy against the Trinity. That's what they had in their constitution. That was the Maryland Toleration Act. The Puritans didn't even like that. But more recently, we have the Legion of Decency, which was where it was a sort of a true ecumenism, where the Catholic Church boycotted the pornography of Hollywood in the 1920s. The Protestants tried it first. They were too divided. They couldn't figure it out. But when the Catholics led that, there were good Protestants who actually called upon the holy name of Jesus, as Charlie Kirk, by all appearances, seems to have done himself. He called upon the holy name of Jesus from his whole heart. That's what all appearances shows, so he's a pious Christian. There were even some Jews who would get on board with that. But only if the Catholic Church leads it. The Catholic Church has to lead it unapologetically. We are just practically speaking, we're the only ones who can do it. And even non-Catholics admit that. They're like, well, many of the non-Catholics want to jump on board when we can actually lead that. I think the March for Life in DC it's very, very Catholic led, but it needs to be a little bit more apologetically Catholic. Like, let's give our brethren who are calling upon the holy name of Jesus, let's give them, hey, this is the solution, guys. This is the long-term solution.
Okay. And Eric, I want to ask you a question. Why does the trans element keep popping up?
Yeah, I think the trans element, as with many things, is a symptom of the problem. The underlying problem is a denial of reality. We saw that. I mean, we've seen that for a very long time. But like, for example, just to take it back to the 1960s, when you had the acceptance of artificial contraception, a denial of the reality of the marital act, what its purpose is. And then, of course, abortion is a denial of reality. That's not really a baby. Gay marriage is, another, denial of reality. You're saying marriage is something it's not. But then fundamentally, the trans thing is so much more like personal. Like the homosexuals, obviously they're in a deep sin. I'm talking about practicing, embracing, people embrace homosexuality. They're in deep sin, but they don't necessarily deny reality quite like the trans people do, because they're basically just kind of warping reality somewhat. Whereas the trans, we've now gone, and that's really what's been happening, warping reality. Then we get to trans, where it's a true denial of reality. And so when you do that, like, all bets are off as far as what you're willing to do, what you will do. I mean, I believe it's likely, like, let's talk about for a second the trans shooter of the Minneapolis or Minnesota church school. Yes. Like, that person had become, like, I think it's like, people sometimes get a little upset when I would say like somebody like that's mentally ill because they're always demonically possessed. I don't think it's an either or. I think it can be both and. And so he's mentally ill in the sense that he just did not recognize reality. And so then, and he feels like he can shape reality. That's the other key point. You deny reality, but then you feel like you can reshape reality. And so to reshape reality, you will do anything. You're willing to do anything. And so it just gets to the point where, yes, you will shoot people up. You will just, because it just is such a mental disease that all the kind of common things that most normal people believe, like it's just not good to shoot an innocent person. Like you don't have to be Christian to think that. Like the average just normal person thinks that. But if you've gone all the way down the trans path, even something as basic as that is no longer on the table. And it's like, okay, well, I'm reshaping reality and I'm going to do whatever it takes to do that. And that includes maybe shooting an innocent man, because I have been told on Reddit, I think there's a Reddit thing here, by the way, on Reddit and other places, that this man is a fascist. He wants to kill me. He wants to destroy me. He's going to cause all these things. So I'm going to reshape reality by killing him to take him out of the picture. So, I mean, there's no question that the acceptance of trans ideology in the last, decade is the reason we've gone from a kind of a limited cold civil war to getting to a point where we're at a hot civil war. And I think the acceptance and pushing of trans ideology is the key factor that's led to that escalation in the conflict.
Are you guys?
All right.
Sorry, go on, Tim.
Is my audio coming through okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Am I all okay? Okay. Just one thing I wanted to mention about that from a Catholic point of view here is that I think we need to be careful in the way our rhetoric works, because it's very easy to sort of, I mean, we all want to blame the problem, identify the problem so we can find a solution. And some people blame these people or those people or this group or that group. And the real enemy is the conspiracy of Antichrist, which is orchestrated by the fallen angels, which are just puppeteering all these different people, the elites, these elite people with a bunch of money, and they're psychological manipulated people. And those people, those evil elites who are puppets of the fallen angels, they then find these vulnerable souls. And I'm not claiming there's conspiracy here. There could be, there could not be. I have no evidence of that. I don't know. But we do know that these elites choose these souls to use them for these overarching ends. And everybody, all these poor souls are victims. And we have created this gender ideology because heterosexuals destroyed marriage first. Heterosexuals destroyed by all this no-fault divorce, insanity, and abortion, which was, happened decades ago. All those heterosexuals justified that. They rationalized it, and these are the fruits. This is the direct fruit of that. And you just mentioned Reddit, which is critically important that we bring up the internet, because the internet is a virtual reality. It's not real life, but it incentivizes unreality. And that's why Taylor Marshall just shared this stat where Gen Z is the highest percentage of LGBT whatever. Like the youngest generation, who was totally raised on social media more than you or I or anybody here. The youngest generation, they were totally on social media. So their whole concept of reality is based on this virtual reality called the internet. And I think I agree with what Eric's saying, though. I think the trans is like a point of no return in a metaphysical error that is showing its ugly face now.
Are you guys familiar with Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher?
Oh, yeah. I've heard of him.
So he's controversial for some reasons. It doesn't matter. But he did have an interview with Tucker Carlson a year ago or something. And it was when Tucker did his interview with Vladimir Putin. He also interviewed for about 30 minutes Alexander Dugin, who has good enough English for an interview. And he offered an interesting critique to like the liberalism, the liberalism of the West, basically. And he basically said that he saw the LGBT thing, the trans thing, as the logical conclusion of liberalism. And his analysis was very sound. And he said, well, and it was very reconcilable with Catholic thinking. And he said, basically, you have this revolution in religion, which leads to a liberal, it leads to a rejection of the authority of the church. And then you have the rejection of the authority of the king, which is liberty from authority itself. And then you get to the point where, like, what are you going to free yourself from? What else is there left to liberate yourself from? Okay, well, we're going to liberate ourselves from creation and the created order. And that's what these things are. We hear in the scriptures that, we're made in the image and likeness of God. Obviously, that image is found in the rational soul. But secondarily, when we think of what is the image and likeness of God, we actually think about, like, images. Like, what do we see? And we see persons, and we see stuff, and we see people, and we see places and things. And this mentality of liberalism cannot allow itself to have any authority over it whatsoever. And once you get rid of the authority of the church, then you get rid of the authority of the king, and then you get rid of the authority of the head of the state, and then you even get rid of the authority of everything as such. Well, now you have to liberate yourself from the fact that you didn't get to decide how you were made, because that's an affront against your quote-unquote dignity. You're not truly free if you have to use a quote-unquote pronoun that was assigned to you at birth, because that's an act of aggression against your freedom. And a lot of these guys advocating for, we just have to go back to the Constitution, and whatever country it is. We have our Constitution there, you got your own. We all have the same problems. We just have to go back to, like, the way the founding fathers or the fathers of Confederation. It's like, well, yeah, obviously, if we could turn the clock back, all of the stuff that's happening right now would sound insane, even to the most, let's say, less savory of individuals like Jefferson,
Right.
who was, even the guys that we wouldn't look at as good guys in the long run, they would say right now, goodness gracious, you guys are insane. Like, this is nuts. Listen to John Adams. You need a moral, religious people. Otherwise, we're all screwed. But it's still ultimately going to lead to the same problem. So I think to transition the conversation now, no transition, pun intended, I think we can all agree there's no hope of reasoning with atheistic leftism. And I call it atheistic leftism because all liberalism is in some ways at least a practical atheism. You can believe in God for psychological reasons, like, yeah, there's a creator and whatever, and that makes me feel good. It's that sort of therapeutic deism that people talk about. Sure, but practically speaking, it's always atheistic. If you think you can reform, even as a Catholic, if you're a liberal Catholic, if you think you can reform the church to fit political movements, you actually don't believe in God, because practically speaking, because Christ did found a church, that church does have dogmas, and you can't change them just because of whatever, of reasons. Okay, so you don't really believe in God. Jordan Peterson, he's taken some weird turns in recent years, but when he was in his heyday, 2015, 2016, 17, and he had all those banger compilations of him just, screaming on campuses and stuff. One of the things that was fascinating about the things he would say, people would say, do you believe in God? And he would say, well, I act as if I do. And it was kind of an evasive answer, but he was kind of on to something, meaning, like, I don't know what that means if you say you believe in God, but you actually don't actually believe in God because you don't act like it. We do need to act like it. So going forward, we know there's no possibility of reconciling with crazy people. And even though, as Tim said, we obviously need to make distinctions, like in our personal lives, like your average, like, soccer mom who loves Kamala Harris, she probably doesn't like mass murder. Nonetheless, she does watch The View. So, it's kind of like in Muslim countries where the average person is, of course, just a regular dude who's very peaceful. But the inherent reasoning behind the theology is that it's very easy to flip a populace when you do it, present them with an existential threat. And that's a very crazy thing. So you have to have both, you have to be aware of both things. Like, of course, you don't just go be a crazy jerk to people because they happen to vote differently. But at the same time, you have to remember that, like, when the chips are down, like, they're not going to have your back, because their way of thinking, their way of thinking is just so fundamentally broken that they can't help it. So, what is our Catholic response? I want to start with in the home, and then I want to see what you guys believe in the civil sphere. So, why don't you go first, Eric? In our Catholic response to this type of atmosphere, what is it in the home?
Yeah, I think I was talking to my wife about this the other day, this weekend, and I really think that Catholic families need to stop with the compromising on just about everything. Like, for example, do you send your kids to public schools? Do you send your kids to public universities? Do you justify it because, well, they have the right program, so my son can get this good job to support his family and all that? But yet, what you're doing is you're paying for the dissemination of this leftist ideology that leads to things like Charlie Kirk getting assassinated. And so I really feel like there needs to be I know the danger is, I know people freak out if you say something like the Benedict option. But I think if you expand it a little bit, first of all, I like the Benedict option properly understood. I don't think it's a go hide in your hole. I think what it really, and I think Roger himself, who, I know he went off the deep end on some stuff, but I think he would agree with this, is like it's establishing local communities that are not being infiltrated by the leftist ideology that does not compromise with it. So your homeschool co-op, local universities like a Benedictine or a Christendom or something like that, various places that you establish that we are not going to allow it to be infiltrated here, the ideology, so that we're not infected by it. It's not just you hole up at your house, but you're building your parish community. And of course, as all three of us know, the traditional Latin Mass communities are some of the best at this, because everybody who joins has taken one step to say, okay, the lies of modernism, I can't take it. They might not, they might, accept some modernism here and there, because we're all, we all do that. We imbibe our culture and stuff like that. But the point is, they're trying to say the most important thing and how I worship God, I'm not going to let modernism infect that. And so I think we just need to build
Represent.
on that,
Uh,
as far
well, I
as,
think
and
actually
not having the compromise.
Gaston
Like,
it
more like
is
when
to
COVID happened, I very much avoided conflict. Like, I just didn't go into stores that required masks and stuff like that. And because my wife does most of the shopping, stuff like that, I didn't have to. And I look back on it, I was like, that was a little cowardly of
Political
me.
syndrome.
I really should have just walked
Uncle
in without a
Dave.
mask on, saying, no, I'm not going to wear it. What are you going to do? But I avoid the conflict. I was like, well, whatever. The person who runs the Walgreens, they're not really the ones who are the evil people. So, but I do think you got to speak up. Your local public library, when it has its transgender display in the children's section, do you just kind of look away and not say anything and get your books for your kids that are good books, and or just avoid, maybe during Pride Month, going to the library? So it's like at some point there has to be the pushback of the natural, and this is like nonviolent pushback, but it's just very much just like, no, I'm not going to just let you people live your lies that and force them upon me. I'm going to basically continue to say the truth. And so it can be difficult at times, but I really feel like that is part of the response as well, is no more compromise, no more just kind of letting the leftists set the cultural agenda. And I've not been great at this myself. And like I said, in the examples I gave, but like, I think that's what we all kind of have to look at more of. Like, yeah, you might get yelled at in public because you don't wear back in the COVID days, you didn't wear the mask where you're supposed to, or whatever the case may be. In the library bans you because you keep on complaining about the transgender display, and you don't send your kids to the public university they want to go to because it supports this evil stuff. Those are type of things, the sacrifices I think that we have to start making.
What do you think, Tim?
I think of John Senior, who kind of talked about the true Benedict option because he was Catholic, not Eastern Orthodox, like Rod Dreher was. But John Senior said the way to convert America is to promote contemplative monasticism, and what this really does is it promotes a return to reality. So that the reality is that the contemplative monastics are on the front lines against the fallen angels. They always have been since St. Anthony the Great of the desert. And they're showing us the reality of the kingdom of God as much as it can be on earth. And this is how civilization grows. So people go to the monastery, they continue to go. Every time they go, they make a retreat, which they have the retreat puts them in contact with reality, and they bring that reality back to wherever they're going, like a light in the darkness. Some people start moving around the monastery. This is already happening in America. People start moving. They start organizing. This is how cities are built. This is how Christendom is built. It gets built around the monasteries. Another back to reality is to have fun with your kids. Have fun with your kids. Bring the joy of the Holy Spirit, because Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And you need to celebrate with a bunch of candy or whatever. Like we're gonna beat up a Satan pinata in a couple weeks for Michaelmas with my kids. That's reality. And my kids are gonna laugh and have a ton of fun. And that is reality. Like, get back to that reality. Get off the internet, which that's unreality. So having fun with your kids in the faith, I feel like that's such a critical piece, because the kids grow up and knowing how awesome it is to know that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And then they go out in the world and they see this darkness, like, what's wrong with you guys? Why are you guys so sad? Didn't you know Christ is risen? You know, like, this is the type of thing we're trying to form here, is what I'm saying. And I want to say also, this is transition to the civil sphere. I want to say we need to stop blaming the clerics for failing to take care of the civil sphere. There's a lot of blame to go around about the clerics. Don't get me wrong. I get that. Like, but it's not really going to do any good for us as lay people to just complain about how the bishops are not proclaiming Christ the King. That Christ the King, as a social kingship of Christ, is primarily the job of those who are literally kings. Each one of us are kings over our family. We have our own kingdoms. And that means we wield the temporal sword, which means basically corporal punishment over our children, or we might kill an unjust aggressor out of self-defense. That's our job. It is unfitting for a priest to be a politician. Unfitting. A priest should not be a politician. A priest should not wield the sword, literally. They shouldn't go into battle. That's the lay job. That's our job. So also, the clerics come from families. Where do you think all these effeminate clerics came from? They came from families who were already effeminate. So it's kind of it always goes back to the lay people. It's like, let's blame ourselves. Let's get to work here. Let's take control of the civic sphere in the name of Jesus, because Jesus is king. He's already on the throne. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't add much to what you guys have said, but I imagine that some people watching or listening would be concerned about practical measures of actually protecting their family. And of course, prudentially, whatever ways of protecting your family, especially whatever's legal, go for it. I mean, that's just a decision people have to make. But I would caution some of our fellow red-blooded males with elevated testosterone levels at a time like this. Don't assume that when something bad happens that you will be Rambo. Unless you have combat experience, or you're like a veteran police officer and you've been in actual firefights, you actually don't know how you're going to react when things like this happen. You could be really good at the range. You could be like an Olympic champion sharpshooter or something. But when it's kind of like, I used to spar and do a little boxing, and I can beat the tar out of a heavy bag. But when you get in the ring, even with a subpar boxer who has experience in the ring, like, he's not a bag. He moves. Okay. So I would, like, as a dad, I don't want to get to the point where I have to pretend to be Rambo. I would rather avoid that from ever happening at all. And I would this is a very practical piece of advice. If you don't have a family dog, and especially if you're in an area where you're worried about violence, like if you're in an area where there's a lot of BLM stuff or something, and like you just can't move. Well, when you look around at the third world, where they have really high murder rates and a lot of this stuff and really high political violence, even people with like private security teams, they will always have really well-trained dogs that are actually trained in home protection on their properties. This is super common in places like South Africa and stuff, because dogs are man's best friend. Dogs are the best. And you don't have to have like some crazy attack dog. But if you do want to have a dog well-trained, I have a family member he's the kind of guy who could like walk a Rottweiler not on a leash downtown Toronto, and like it wouldn't even look at someone unless he gave it the command to. Like, he's really good at training dogs. And I asked him, because we have a pretty good dog. Tim's met my dog, and shout out to Jack. And I asked him, like, what should I do if I wanted to really train him to be like a real guard dog, not just the family dog who barks when people knock at the door, but like a real guard dog. And he said, send him to one of those training facilities where it's like, you know, people who train the canine unit dogs and stuff like that. You know, you send them there for 2 weeks, they come back and they'll have like 100 commands and they know what they're doing. I would recommend that. Like, practically speaking, that's, I think, one of the best things that you can do is to train a dog. And because if you have a dog that has a loud bark, he knows what to do, he knows how to protect, he knows the difference between intruder and friend. Hopefully you'll get to the point where you never actually have to try to be Rambo, which is always a good thing to avoid that. Okay, this is the last question I'm going to ask, and then we'll sign off here. Realistically, because this ties into the civil sphere. Realistically, what can America and other nations with similar issues, because we all have various versions of this problem, what can we do to bring about a solution that Catholics can support? And the reason I want to qualify this, Catholics can support. If I was in the States as a Catholic and the dominant like conservative movement was we need to Charlie Kirk harder, I would say, I just don't think it's going to work, guys. Like, for one, you're just going to keep advocating for freedom of speech, which is just not Catholic. And you're going to keep advocating for basically an ecumenism of all religions, you know, like which is practically what Protestantism is. And there's just major problems there are major problems in the TPS USA movement. Like, there's a lot of homosexuality in the sense of like, as long as you're a gay conservative, like, you're good. These things aren't going to work in the long run. So not like my general Franco fantasies, which I hope become realities, but like an actual practical thing. Like, what do you guys think? Maybe I'll start with you, Tim. What can actually happen in a Catholic can truly support it right now that combats this type of stuff?
I think so. First of all, setting aside the contemplative community, which is not practical for most people, I think, or even moving near a monastery. It always has to start with the spiritual, the primacy of the spiritual, because Jesus is king on the throne and the fallen angels want to be worshipped. That's the reality that's governing everything else. So it has to begin with the spiritual. So one of the most easiest thing is just to start with lay-led processions in your city and community. And Eric can speak to this, and when he talks, because he's done it successfully in Cincinnati for a while. And because you do not need permission from a priest to walk down the street with banners for Jesus the King. You do not need permission. Obviously, you want the priest involved, want the priest there, but if he says no and doesn't like it or whatever, say, okay, I'm sorry, Father, but we're going to do it anyways because Vatican II says we should have the, quote Vatican II to whatever, it doesn't matter. But get out in the street because Jesus is king. You don't need permission for that. You are the lay nobleman who governs the temporal society. So organize it with whatever, start the movement, which is spiritual, and then other people will get on board, other Catholics, and then, like I said, you're going to have other non-Catholics who also like that somehow, and you need to welcome them as long as they understand that you're unapologetically Catholic, and that's that. There's no discussion about that. So you got to welcome them with a smile. So I think that's a critical piece. I think there's other communities that have more possibilities, like Little Christendom on the Prairie, St. Mary's, Kansas, where you already have the mass of the population. I'm not saying majority vote creates truth, but I'm just saying if you have, practically speaking, everybody there is pretty much Catholic, or there's a few non-Catholics who like living there, so they're okay with the status quo, then you can start practical means of de facto secessionism. What do I mean by that? I mean peaceful, nothing violent. I'm not advocating violence. I'm just saying you're proclaiming that Jesus is king over your city because he already is, whether you like it or not. And saying so makes it just spiritually kicks out the fallen angels who want to be worshiped there anyways. And then from the fact that Jesus is king over your community, that means that the mayor needs to celebrate Holy Mass in his public state house, whatever it is. And something like that is possible at St. Mary's. I don't know why they haven't done it yet. And maybe they have, I don't know. But they need to explicitly say our authority comes from the true King, Jesus Christ. Whatever, if they have voting or whatever, it doesn't need to be like an actual monarchy, but there is an actual monarchy called Jesus Christ. So then you can do that. And that, to me, I'm saying that's de facto secessionism, because you've already denied the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and you've actually you've really restored the 13 colonies in a sense, because they all had, or many of them had state churches, many of them had oaths of office for Jesus Christ, right? So you're actually restoring something that was in the beginning, but we're not trying to do like Kennedy said, we're not trying to say like, oh, we're a Christian nation per se. But that is, practically speaking, and then if the feds try to come after you and say, no, you can't do that because of the First Amendment, say no, Jesus is king. There's no discussion. That's my practical piece. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah, I think all that, like, I think is great. We did a great whole Exaltation of the Holy Cross procession on Saturday through downtown Cincinnati, and it was very nice. Men, walking through the streets of Cincinnati with a nice big crucifix and Sacred Heart flags and things like that. Which I think that's so important, that we're making ourselves visible. We're standing up for the truth. I would say on a bigger scale than what Tim was talking about. Okay, so like I get in a lot of trouble because of my libertarian leanings. The truth is, I look at these things very practically. I'm a libertarian in a secular government, a secular nation, and I'm a conservative in a Catholic nation. We don't live in a Catholic nation, which is what makes me a libertarian, is because the fact is I don't want these atheistic secular rulers telling us what to do and all that. That all being said, it's like, okay, there gets a point though where it becomes impossible to even live out your faith. Then it's like, okay, we might have to look to a secular government to help crush the enemies. I mean, I already started a little bit. I mean, here's an example where my libertarian kind of bias in secular government would be against what Donald Trump did in DC, bringing in the National Guard. Because I think, okay, that's, I don't really want the National Guard, roaming our streets and having an authoritarian type of attitude, because then they come after us, all that stuff. And I think I still have that kind of instinct. The truth is, though, when you get to the point where it's just chaos, you get to a point where it's lawlessness, there has to be a point where it's like, okay, there needs to be order restored. And God has appointed government leaders as that sword to impose order. And so that's what Trump did in DC. Now, you could argue, was it really needed in DC? Was it so bad? I mean, everything I've heard, I lived outside DC for 10 years, and everybody I've talked to from the area says it's gotten really bad, much worse than even when I was there 20 years ago. So you can debate whether or not it was the time or not. But at some point, it's like, well, we just have to do this. It just because we have to have some order in the public sphere in order for Catholicism to be preached, to be lived out, and things like that. So I admit I've gotten more open to the idea of the government having to step in and use means that I don't really like a secular government using. But the fact is like, if we don't, we just have complete lawlessness and chaos, and we have the leftists winning, and we're all dead or like in prison. So who cares about our, philosophical debates? So I think that would be things I think a Catholic can support, even from a secular government, is like when you feel like you've crossed, I feel like if you've crossed a certain line, if the culture of the society has crossed a certain line, yeah, you're going to have to ask the secular government to step in and say, we have to stop this stuff. So yeah, I think even things like, to use one example of, should the government step in and shut down MSNBC, for example? I mean, I would have said absolutely no, absolutely not for years and years and years. Now I say, well, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. I'm not an absolute yes yet, but I am like, I think that should be on the table. And then you get to a point where I brought this up and kind of freaked out some people after Mass yesterday. What about Trump says we're going to shut down the Democratic Party because it's a party supporting murder and transgenderism, blah, whatever. It's like, is that off the table? I don't know. I mean, and of course, the first thing you'd say is, well, that's what Hitler did. He said, I know he did it. And I know, but Hitler isn't the all of history. So I think these are the type of things that I think as Catholics, we should at least look into, debate, and consider. Always with the idea, though, one thing I get frustrated by when I see some of the debate online on Catholics, traditional Catholics particularly, is they they make the perfect the enemy of the good, in the sense that they're like a Catholic monarchy. That's the only thing they want to talk about. We're not getting a Catholic monarchy, barring a miracle from God directly, any time in our lifetimes. So the question's got to be, okay, what do we want this secular government, which is what we have? What powers do we want it to have in this current situation? 20 years ago, I would have said a lot less than I do today. But we always have to recognize it's a secular government we're giving power to, not a Catholic monarchy.
Yeah, I'll just finish off here by adding, so I read a lot about the Spanish Civil War in university, and it was very Marxist inspired. And I look back, and I was just like a nothing Catholic at the time. I wasn't like a communist, but I didn't really care. I was just like, oh, I'll get a good mark in the class. To be honest, the teacher was very much a feminist, and it really annoyed me. I can't prove it, but man, oh man, like it was way harder to get an A if you were a guy. It just was. And that's how she was. But anyway, so I studied like Franco and the Spanish Civil War in Spanish, like Spanish writings, firsthand accounts, that sort of thing, from the Marxist perspective. Like, we had one optional reading about Franco that you could read if you wanted to, that was written by somebody who was a conservative. And everything else was obligatory, and it was just like the Republicanos, they were such wonderful, they were advocates for freedom and free love, and we didn't want the suppression of religion and blah 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 blah. So I've heard that side. Unless you're a professional historian, I can guarantee the viewers and listeners, I've read more about the Spanish Civil War than you have in Spanish. And because I had to, I was required to. And since I've, in years, had my conversion both politically and religiously, I've looked at the other side, and like Franco was a hero. Was he Saint Franco? Well, most leaders are not Saint so-and-so. But he certainly was Franco the good. He certainly was Franco the just. And, but what's interesting is he's painted as this like reactionary right-wing guy. But when you actually watch his life, it's amazing to see how moderate he was and how incremental he was and how obedient to the lawful authorities he tried to be for a long time. And then only when he was pushed to the point where it was beyond possibility that he could have anything to do with the revolutionaries because it was an existential threat, only then, after he gained people's trust, after he demonstrated how moral he was, after he had been so professional and so moderate in his actions, only then did he get to work. And if there's going to be any hope for our societies to really purify itself of this liberalism, aside from the Catholic solution of like grace and, miracle and conversion and the mass and all those things, which of course we need to advocate for, from a practical perspective, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to have the right types of people who could even approach a General Franco response. And we have to understand that the only types of individuals who can do that kind of response have to be people who commandeer basically military power. That's pretty much it. Like, guys out there thinking that they're going to go be Rambo and get a militia or something like that, like you're not. You're just not going to do that. So don't fall into that temptation. It's not going to happen. And quite frankly, you're going to make things worse. And Franco was huge on that. He declined being part of like half a dozen different right-wing uprisings against the communists because he saw them as too reckless, and he saw them, even though he agreed with their instincts, he said, you're not going to win, and they're going to come down on us harder. And he was right every time. And that's why, in the end, all of the various right-wing groups, from the Carlists to the Phalangists and so forth, they were able to unify under Franco because he was the only guy who they could say to themselves, he really saw all this clearly, and our defects are solved by his moderation and his ability to sort of bring people who believe the right stuff enough to work together. And so I would recommend for all Catholics listening to this to check out 3 resources. And I'm going to do a show on Franco soon on my channel, but 3 resources. One, Warren Carroll wrote a book called The Last Crusade. These are all in English, by the way. The Last Crusade. Another one was written by a Spanish author named Pio Mola. I think it's called The Myths of the Spanish Civil War, or something like that. It's translated into English. It was a bestseller in Spain, caused a lot of controversy, which means it was correct. And it was written about 20 years ago. It's really good. He's a real historian. He's clearly not against Franco, but he does a good job as a real historian. And then there's a YouTube channel called Zoomer Historian. Now, I've not watched every single thing on Zoomer Historian. My instinct when I look at some of the titles of some of the videos, it might be that sort of Zoomer, how should I put this lightly? That sort of Nick Fuentes persuasion where maybe you're getting a little bit too conciliatory towards some of the stuff that happened in Germany. Nonetheless, the 2 specials that he did on the Spanish Civil War and General Franco's life, really, really top-notch stuff, giving you the other side. So I would recommend becoming acquainted with men like him. Also Salazar from Portugal. And last thing I'll say is, I'm going to use the F word, fascism. There were defects in Mussolini. There certainly were. He was not the monster people think he was, but there were major defects. And he did have this animosity with the hierarchy of the church for certain reasons. There was still a bit of liberalism in the fascism when you really look at it, because it did subjugate the power of the church to the permission of the state. And that was problematic. That is inherent in liberalism. So study those guys. Study Franco for a good example, but study the actual fascist movements to know what they're accusing you of, but also to see that there are defects in it, because there's a temptation in moments like this for young men to say like, wow, Mussolini was so strong against the communists. It's like, well, certainly he was, but there were defects that led to the downfall of Italy. And then after his death, he was betrayed by the Western powers, and Italy got worse than it was before him, because he didn't actually root out the root cause of liberalism, which was he didn't root out the root cause of the communism, which was liberalism. My daughter's screaming in the background. I'll edit it out after. All right. My kids are screaming. That's time. That means it's time to end the show. That's all I got for you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you both guys for coming on here. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, check out the link in the description for Pelican, this project Tim and I have been working on with some others. You're going to be excited about that when it comes out. Check out Crisis Magazine. Check out Me Catholic. And that's all I got. So God bless you guys, and we'll talk soon.